Hello, guys, and welcome back to the HVAC Shop Talk podcast. My name is Zach Ciota. I am your host. Today, I want to talk about a place I worked, a subdivision, and this was around 2005, 6, 7, right in there, right before the housing bubble. And for those of you that are younger technicians or younger owners that don't remember the housing bubble or didn't work during the housing bubble, what had happened is there was a lot of inflated prices on housing. There was a lot of issues, government oversight issues, and I don't even understand the whole thing, but I know bits and pieces of it. I'm not going to tell you that I do understand that stuff. But around 2008, there was a tremendous downturn in the economy because of this issue. And for the next few years after that, everything went kind of bust until it kind of rebounded a few years later. In the years before that particular time period, I was working at a subdivision called Sagewood. And Sagewood was a place where they built pretty nice homes. I mean, this was homes at that time, and this is kind of skewed because prices were inflated at that time. That homes were selling for 300,000, 400,000 in this place, and they probably ranged from, I don't know, 2,000 square foot to 3,000 square foot. So they're not tremendously big houses, but decent sized houses. And the price tag here now for those is probably less than that than it was then. I mean, these things have come down in cost. Everything was building and building and building at that time, literally and figuratively. I mean, the prices of the houses were going up. There was a tremendous amount of construction. We were doing jobs in Carolina Beach, Curie Beach. We did some work in Wrightsville Beach. And I'm mentioning the beach communities because of the cost of these houses. Doing these jobs, there were like duplexes, triplexes, which are just the same as duplexes except three, where you would go in there and they would be right on the waterfront, and you'd be dealing with a house that cost millions of dollars. I remember seeing the potential mortgages whenever they have the sell sheet for the real estate agents, and they show you the potential mortgages and what percentage they were, and you see the monthly payment was $7, $8, $9, $10,000 a month for these mortgages. And many of you, especially in my area, southeastern United States, especially the rural parts, you know how exorbitant that sounds. The mortgage at my house is $900. That puts it all into perspective. And this is in the same area. We're talking 30, 40 miles away from here, and your rent goes up that many times because you're on the beach. So these people had money to burn. These places were selling. Some of these were even spec. And spec means they were building those without having a customer that has bought them. They're building it to sell. So a lot of these guys were putting out these spec houses, and they got overextended. Well, Sagewood was a little bit different. They built houses, and they did build some of them at spec, but a lot of them were built for particular homeowners. And at the time, I wasn't running that subdivision. I mean, my crew wasn't in there, and I don't know if I actually had a crew. I might have had one helper at the time. Looking back, I think it was just one helper. And so I was working other places. I was doing install, wasn't doing service at the time. I was doing installation, which I had done for the last several years before that. Most of the time, we did new construction. We did a lot of new construction in the 90s and early 2000s. It was just a ton of it. A lot of custom homes, but a little bit of track homes and stuff like that. So just a good mix of stuff. We do bigger houses, but not extremely big, like 3, 4, maybe a 5,000 square foot house every now and then. A couple of times we do a really, really big house. And there's a couple of them that were over 10,000 square feet. And it was like, wow. We always say the same thing. I can feel like 12 of my houses in here. At the time, that was true. My father has a crew he's put into Sagewood to do work there. The crew is a sub crew, meaning that they didn't directly work for him. They were like 1099 employees that he hired, paid X amount of dollars per ton install or something like that. I don't remember what the arrangement was, but I do believe it was X amount of dollars per ton, depending on the install. So these guys would go in there and they'd run these jobs. And for a while, it was fine. Everything was quiet. We'd check on them every now and then. And we, as in not me, my father would. Then one day he goes in there and everything's in like disarray. The jobs are done in a non-professional manner. Everything's a mess. The job's not done and it's not structured well. It's one thing for a job to be unfinished at a certain point. There's another thing for it to be unstructured. And what I mean is you'll have a rough-in phase and a trim-out phase when you're doing new construction. And sometimes the rough-in phase can be broken up depending on what you have to do inside the house. So rough-in, you're getting that ductwork in typically. Anything that's hidden in the walls, you had to put in like thermostat wires, drop ducts, venting, a lot of times range venting, whether it be a microwave, a range hood, or whatever, bath fan venting, just anything that's going to be in the walls and anything you can really get done before the trim out phase. You'll set air handlers, furnaces, coils, and typically not the condensers outside until the very end of the job. And that's how you bill it out. So you bill it out like 70, 20, 10, something like that. That's 70%, 20%, 10% at the very end, or CO or whatever. So people structure that different ways. But when you go in there and things aren't done, for example, you have like a crawl space job. You have an air handler in the crawl space, and this is typical in the Southeast. You have an air handler in the crawl space. You'll have the duct work done. You'll have the branch ducts done. You have the line set run outside and shut off, or maybe there's a pressure port on it where you can test it or something like that. You'll have the venting roughed in, maybe not completely, but you'll have it roughed into the outside of the structure. Then you'll put a cap on whenever you're doing trim out. So that's how rough in should be done. But these guys would come in here and they would leave parts of it off. Like they'd leave some of the ductwork off and do it at the trim out, or save it for the trim out. Whether that was because and here's what I think, they ran out of time and went to a different job. They wanted to collect some payment, which they did, then they went to a different job. And that's what I think was happening. Now, I'm not positive about that. That is my speculation. So my father shows up to these jobs and they're not done in the rough in phase at all. And it's all messed up. There's like ducts aren't run for some of them. It's stuff that it could be done on final, but it's not how things should be done. And a lot of guys will know what I mean. You can't do jobs like that because it gets to be in disarray and it's hard to keep track of it like that. It's like, oh, I got to run 3 ducts in the crawl space. Then let me forget about those. And then you'll go to start the system up and you'll realize, oh, I forgot to hook up the toe space in the kitchen. Toe space, by the way, is you like have a cabinet and you'll have a toe kick register in the bottom of it. And the toe space will actually come up underneath the cabinet. Now, back at that time, you didn't have to duct it out to the edge of the cabinet. Now you actually have to duct it out in metal to the edge of the cabinet. There's a lot of stuff that was different during this time period. This is the same time period where in the South you had to switch to 13-SEER equipment. And I want to say it's either January 1 of 2006 or 2007, because I remember all the stuff was trained equipment, and we were using 12-SEER train when we started it, and then we switched to 13-SEER train whenever it was mandated, whichever year that was. So after that, my father couldn't trust the people. He didn't feel confident in them, so he switched over and had me go over there. And I had a crew of 1 or 2. I'm trying to remember who all was with the crew initially. It might have been just 1. So we started and we went, bam, house to house to house to house. There were 4 different house models in this particular place. I don't remember their names. I can sort of slaughter it. I know there's the Tremont. It was 3 stories. It was the only 3-story. The Ashland or Ashmont or something like that. And then 2 others. I have no idea. I don't remember. I remember I could see them in my mind. I could see the streets. I can see some of the people that lived there afterwards, but I cannot for the life of me remember what the names of those things were. So we started knocking these things out, and I'll tell you what, it was a great learning experience for me because it's the first time I really had a crew of my own, and I got to design with guidance. And keep it in mind, at this time, I did have an HVAC contractor's license because I actually got that when I was 19 back in 1999. And this is several years later. So I knew how to design duct systems. I knew how to size them. I wasn't sizing these. So I would go in there and design duct systems. It wasn't just good practice for designing. It was good practice of running a job and actually trying to plan out your days, your weeks, because you can't just plan out one day. You have all these houses going on and you're going to be called to various houses because a lot of them are going to be in similar stages. So you're going to have to pick which houses you're going to next, what materials you're going to need next. And I would love to say that I was flawless at this, but I was not. In fact, I do remember further on in this development, there was one house that had a lot of our extra duct pipe, and there was all this snap lock round pipe just piled up in that house, and I had to return it to Johnstone. It was almost embarrassing. I was like, man, I should have used this better. I should have been more efficient. I should have not ordered so much or whatever. Well, let's say it's something like this. Let's say I need 17 foot of trunk to get past this pier, so I order 20. But it turns out you move the air handler, you only needed 15. So you have an extra piece of pipe. So what do you want to do with the piece of pipe? So we could either return it now, which we probably should have done, or we could store it. We'll just use it on the next job. All right, we stored it. Forgot to use it on the next job, and we got an extra piece there too. You see how it kind of snowballs. So it pays to try to get that number as close to what you need as possible without going over. It's like Price is Right. Don't go over too far. You don't want to go under either because that's going to screw you up and that's going to waste a lot of time. But going too far over is just wasteful. And we did talk about this. Joe Canada was talking about this with me before the overtime show, and I think we touched on it a little bit last week. But it's one of those things that you really need to get a grip on. And it's not good enough just to order too much every single time. you really need to be good about getting the exact amount. That way you're not wasteful. You don't have to return stuff, because if you have to go and return a bunch of stuff at the end of a job, that's a wasted trip too. And there's always a restocking charge at these places. They want to charge you, I forget what it is. It's X percent to restock. It might be 10%, which is a significant amount. If you were returning $500 or $600 in ductwork, I mean, that's 50 or 60 bucks right there. That's a full tank of gas at that time, probably, for one of the vans. Another thing I ran into working in these places is trying to corral men at a job, trying to get people to do what you want them to do, how you want to do it, without A, being overbearing or dickish, which is not what you want to be, or B, being hands off and a doormat where they're running around doing whatever they want. It's a really tough thing to be able to do, to execute the plan like that. And I was really uncomfortable with it, because at the time, think about it, I'm 25, 26 years old, telling people, a lot of them older than me, what to do. And a lot of people have a real big problem with that. They don't like to be told what to do by someone they perceive as less experienced. Like, there was guys out there that were in their 30s. I think one guy was in his 40s, and they didn't like to hear that. I mean, I realized that. And at the time I was so young, I was a little nervous about it, because I felt the same way. I felt like I wasn't experienced enough to be telling these guys what to do. But I did have a license. I did go to school. I got my license. So I was qualified to do the job. But it took a long time for me to actually believe in myself that I was qualified. In fact, it never really happened at Sagewood. I worked on it. I improved. But it wasn't until years later that I kind of fell into that role and was able to do that when I started my own company and I was behind the wheel myself, and all the pressure was on me. And once all the pressure was on me, I realized that I could handle it, and I needed to execute things to make it work out for the company, because once the pressure's on, you rise with the responsibility you need to meet the challenge. And once you do that, there's a certain amount of pride that you achieve. There's a certain amount of, you wake up in the morning and goes, all right, well, I can do this. I've done something. I've handled this pressure. I'm ready to rise to the role of a boss or a crew leader. But the whole time at Sagewood, I was working on that. I never really got to that point. There were times where, you know what, I couldn't contain my emotions. I remember one time, and it wasn't at Sagewood, but it was during this time period, where this one guy would always, it wasn't like a direct opposition or talking back. It was just one of those passive aggressive things. And I remember I snapped one time and was just yelling back at him, and it wasn't the way to handle it. It was either 0 or 60. There was no in between for me. So I needed to realize that you have to diffuse the situation, yet still handle the problem. And how I handled the problem, I just snapped. I got angry, I yelled, and it really wasn't the way to deal with it, because I didn't know how to do that sort of negotiation and diplomacy that a true crew leader or boss should have. It's not all about telling people what to do and being all powerful or a dictator. It's about leading people and showing them what to do through example. And when you need to correct something, you don't belittle somebody or come to blows or whatever. That day was a rough day. I really hated that job, and I hated doing that because I didn't understand how to do it. And that was tough. Over time, I got a little bit better at it, but corralling some of these guys was a handful, because you leave the job. We talked about this the other day too. You leave a job to go do something, and they complete a task, and it just, everything stops. Everything freezes. We're all done. No one's doing anything any longer. And you really have to kind of spur the initiative on here, guys. If you get done with this, go on, you can move on to X, Y, or Z. And sometimes you have to spell it out like that. There'll be a few guys that will have the initiative. They'll rise to the occasion, and they'll be able to handle things on their own. That's your future bosses. That's your future crew leaders. But a lot of times, I mean, guys aren't in it because they love HVAC. A lot of guys who listen to these podcasts and watch the videos, they love their job. They really enjoy their job. They study their job in their spare time. But most of the people that work in the field, it's just a job. And it's not like there's something tremendously wrong with that, as long as they execute their job properly and at least take pride in doing things properly. I mean, you can take pride in doing your job without being in love with your job. I hope that makes sense. I know a lot of you guys go home and you study stuff. You cut compressors apart. You want to figure out how things work. You want to become better at your job, whether it be in the sales category, in the technical category. You're always studying so you can get better. Well, a lot of these guys, they don't care anything about that. They'll do what they have to do to make more money. They'll do what they have to do just to get their stuff done so they can go home, and that's it. And that's just the way it is. You're not going to be able to find a crew full of guys that are just upstanding citizens that go home and read the carrier psychometric charts and fall asleep, just reciting different gas laws. It's not going to happen. I mean, it's impossible. And a problem that I have still to this day is trying to reconcile dealing with those people instead of just dealing with the guys who just love the job and they're just ready to learn, ready to do whatever. It's a really tough thing to do. You have to be realistic. You can't be surreal thinking everybody's going to go to the job and like, oh man, this duct system looks beautiful. Man, I'm taking great pride in this. Is great. There's going to be guys that say, all right, I'm finished with this. I'm going to head on out unless you have something else. They're out of here. They don't care about impressing everybody. They don't care about furthering their knowledge. They just want to get done and go home. And that's just the way it is sometimes, guys. That's just the way it is. Sure, you can kind of weed some of them out during the hiring process, but I don't think there's enough guys out there like the guys that listen to these podcasts to fill up any crew anywhere. It's just how the world is. People are concerned about, their iPhones and stuff like that. People are concerned about getting home and watching TV and crap like that. They're not necessarily fired up to become the best HVAC technician they can be. Like I said, there's nothing wrong with that. The world is what it is. And a lot of you guys are a little bit different than the average HVAC employee. That doesn't mean we still can't learn something from these guys either. These guys know all the best cable channels. These guys know the best places to go after work. I'm just kidding. I just wanted to share a little bit about Sagewood, guys, because it was an experience that I'll never forget. I mean, I was there for 2 or 3 years. We did several houses. We'll talk more about it. I just want to touch on it a little bit because it was an interesting time. Like I said, I learned a lot about who I was as a crew leader, who I was as an installer. But the best thing in the world happened shortly after that is I took up service and done service ever since, and I just love it. Every time I go back to install, it makes my stomach turn. I'm just kidding, sort of. I'm just sort of kidding. It doesn't make my stomach turn, but then again, I don't particularly love it either. And now that I'm doing podcasts, every now and then I do miss service. I really do. I miss troubleshooting. That was probably my favorite part. And there's a lot of it that I see it like a lottery almost. What's going to be wrong with this one? What's going to be wrong with this one? As a business owner, I was like, oh, if it's a compressor's bad, I can change it out too. That'll be fun. You guys know what I mean. It's exciting. It's fun. And I do miss that. But I have a great time talking about these experiences with you guys now. If you have any comments, put them down below. If you have any suggestions, you want to like this video, please like it. Put your thumb up, subscribe, and all that good stuff. And I hope I see you guys on the next one.